the trust has been thinking a lot about economic disparities due to the historic segregation and racism that our region has faced because of disinvestment. And our focus is on growing household wealth, catalyzing neighborhood investment, and building collective power. And we're thinking also a lot about public policy. And I have the honor and privilege of overseeing our Addressing Critical Needs strategy, which works alongside closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap. And the theory there is, as we think about reversing and reforming a lot of the predatory practices that have stripped wealth in our Black and Brown communities, that we have immediate needs that need to be addressed today. And with that, I'm going to pass it to my former colleague, Tony Martinez.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tony Martinez, and I am the president and CEO of the Oak Park River Forest Community Foundation. I want to thank Stuart and Jennifer for inviting me to participate on this panel, along with Anna, Steve, Owen, and Mignon. I feel very fortunate to share this morning with you. For the past 60 years, the Oak Park River Forest Community Foundation has mobilized resources, engaged people, and also worked with donors to establish their long-term living legacy of giving. And the foundation has really served as a cornerstone for the Oak Park River Forest community. Over the past, I would say, 5 years or so, we've expanded our geographical reach to include other areas of Western Cook County, such as places such as Maywood, Forest Park, Austin neighborhood in Chicago, Cicero, and Berwyn. And our focus has been primarily with regards to housing, homelessness, focus on education through our Successful Youth Program, environmental sustainability, and leadership. And for the, we're not the size of the trust where I was happily at for 10 years, but we are a small and mighty team. We're about 50 million, close to 50 million in assets. However, it's important to note that out of 2.5 million that we grant out every year, 97% of that is restricted through donors' advisements. So we have a little bit to work with in terms of plugging into different areas. In response to COVID, our organization over the past year was able to bring in over $1 million in resources. And that money was raised by the foundation. It's the first time we ever did such an initiative in our history. And all that money that came in was granted out. We did that as our part of being a benefit to the community. So I look forward to sharing some thoughts, answering any questions, and sharing this morning with you. So thank you. So I will forward it over if I can do my alphabet right to begin.
Great. Thanks,
Tony. I had to do my ABCs.
There you go. Thank you, Tony. And thanks, Stuart and Jennifer, for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful panel. I'm glad to be here with everyone that's participating. My name is Mignon Stewart. I'm the Senior Program Officer at Prince Charitable Trusts. We're a family foundation. We're headquartered here in Chicago, Illinois, but we also have an office in Washington, D.C., and we have giving programs in Chicago, Washington, D.C., and in Newport, Rhode Island. We're a relatively small family foundation. Across the entire foundation, we grant out about $5.3 million a year. And here in Chicago, it's a little over $2 million average in a typical year. Program areas that we have here in Chicago are ending youth homelessness, violence reduction, sports-based youth development, arts and culture, and the environment. We also administer the MacArthur Fund for the Arts at Prince, which has its own budget of about $1.9 million. I'll say more later, but that's kind of an overview of our foundation. And now I shall happily pass this on to Owen.
Good morning, everyone. Great to be with you, and really have been looking forward to this. Thanks to Stuart and Jennifer for organizing. So I'm a Vice President of Philanthropy at JP Morgan Chase and a Program Officer at the JP Morgan Chase Foundation. Our mission is around economic opportunity and racial equity in the economy, and with focus areas in workforce development and career readiness, small business development, neighborhood revitalization, and financial health. Those areas are consistent everywhere that our firm operates, but the strategies and the investments that we make are very much distinctive to particular communities. There are also areas where we think we have both philanthropic resources to contribute, but also internal assets of a large firm and a large financial firm. So we often think at the intersection of what our philanthropic work can accomplish, along with the critical work that our business and our business practices and products and services in communities can do to reduce racial inequities in particular around in the economy. Specifically, I help lead our Chicago commitment, which is $40 million over 3 years in those areas, and happy to talk more about that. I also lead our foundation's work in Minnesota and Canada. So with that, happy to turn it over to Steve.
Good morning, everyone. Just wanted to start by saying thank you to the Philanthropy Club and Forefront, and a special thanks to Jennifer and Stuart for organizing us. My name's Steve. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Director of Veteran Programs at Grand Victoria Foundation. I've been with the foundation for a little more than a year. So I'm a relative rookie to the world of philanthropy and foundations. So the ELGIN program is one of 5 program areas at the Grand Victoria Foundation. We refer to them as the 5 E's. Those 5 E's include ELGIN, environment, economy, education, and engagement. These programs emphasize systems change and being people-focused, and this continues to evolve, but I'll touch upon that later. One thing that distinguishes us as a foundation is that we are statewide in focus. We actually do not fund work that is Chicago specific. This means we have grantee partners in Mattoon and East St. Louis, and of course, Elgin. And we are continually refining our statewide strategy and really thinking about how we emphasize and operationalize racial equity and racial justice. The majority of our grant making are 2-year general operating grants. And just a couple notes about us internally, our staff is 70% BIPOC. And we are largely a collection of individuals who have worked in a variety of fields, including community organizing, legislative advocacy, and direct service, which, with the leadership of Sharon Bush, who's our executive director, we have a really incredible internal culture and support system, in which we, try our best to actualize in our work and our relationships with our partner grantees and with the community. So just want to encourage you all. Hopefully we can chat after this and develop some relationships. So thank you.
And Steve, could you repeat the 5 E's? Somebody asked for that.
Absolutely. The 5 E's include ELGIN, which is our only place-based strategy right now, environment, economy, education, and the newest, which is engagement.
Thank you. Jennifer.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing a portion of your morning with us. So Stuart Jameson, who is my co-moderator for today, is a plant giving professional. And I have the honor of serving in the philanthropy department at Rush University Medical Center. So this morning's session was planned with you in mind, our colleagues that are frontline fundraisers, that are program officers, that are major gift officers, planned gift officers, and all of the other amazing things that you do. We planned this session for you. And so what that means is that we will not be waiting until the end of today's session to ask you to share your questions. You can start using the Q&A right now, which I see a couple of you have already done because you're assertive people who are amazing. You've already started using the Q&A. Please use it now and use it throughout the session to post your questions to our panelists. Now, we do have some planned questions that I will ask of our panelists, and a few of them will lead off responding to those questions, and then the other panelists will jump in. But throughout our conversation, we will be integrating your questions into the dialogue. So again, any questions that you have, please use the Q&A. Everybody is muted and will remain muted, but please use that Q&A whenever a question pops up for any of our panelists, and Stuart will jump in and ask those questions. So I want to say in particular, specifically, if you have a question for Grand Victoria about Grand Victoria Foundation, or a question specifically for Steve, he does have to leave at 10 a.m. for a previously scheduled meeting. So if you have something specifically for him or about Grand Victoria, please try to get that in before 9:55 or so that way he has an opportunity to respond to your question. So with that being said, let's kick it off. So we know 2020 was something else, was it not? And one of the major situations that happened in 2020 is something that has changed all of our lives, personally as well as professionally. It changed the way we reside, the way we recreate. It also changed the way we work. It changed the way our organizations operate, how we engage with our constituents, and how we engage with our partners. And so our first question this morning for our panelists is, how did your foundations in particular respond to COVID-19? For this particular question, Anna Lee from Chicago Community Trust and Mignon Stewart from Prince Charitable Trust are going to start us off, and then our other panelists will join in afterwards. So Mignon, I will start with you, and then Anna, you can follow up, and we'll go to the other panelists about how your foundations responded to COVID-19. Mignon?
Sure. So for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to focus on the Chicago program, although we responded in similar ways across the entire foundation. So like everyone else in mid-March, we shifted in, well, everyone who had the privilege to, I should say, we shifted to working from home. And our priority immediately became, how can we support our nonprofit partners as they dealt with the realities of COVID on the ground. And so our leadership, the first thing that they did was they met with our board of trustees and came to an agreement on a couple of things. The first was they agreed to increase the amount of the percentage of giving from the corpus for the year, so that we would have access to additional funds. That allowed us to maintain giving to our current grantees at their normal levels, and also gave us additional funds to work with to respond directly to COVID. We then went into accelerating our grant making programs. So we wanted to get money out the door as quickly as we could. And so we usually have a spring cycle and a fall cycle. And for 2020, we kind of had a spring cycle and a late spring, early summer cycle. So usually our last giving cycle is in November, and in 2020, it was in July. So we just moved things quickly. And part of what allowed us to do that was streamlining the proposal process. So we really pared down in terms of what we asked grantees to submit for the year. Of course, we did everything virtually, just a small administrative thing that I think our nonprofit partners appreciated was we finally moved on an administrative thing that we had said we wanted to do for years, which was just move to electronic checks. It seems like such a really small thing, but it's one of those things that administratively got put off. And this situation kind of moved us into gear into getting that done so we could literally get money out to people in their hands as quickly as we possibly could. We were also able to, we increased the grant amounts in several of our program areas for grantees who were more frontline. I'll talk a little bit about our arts response in another question, but the arts was one of those areas that we did increased giving in, along with our ending youth homelessness area and other organizations that were directly impacted by COVID. I think that's kind of an overview of how we try to respond. I'll say one other thing we did change. We used to have written final reports. We moved to our final reports being conversations instead. We've continued that into 2021, and that looks like that's going to be a permanent change in the way we do business going forward. So I think that's an overview. I'll pass it on to Anna. You want to talk about the trusts?
Yeah, thanks, Mignon. You know, the trust this past year, I feel like we have been a hive of activity where, you know, amid COVID and the racial uprisings, we've been responsive to the region's, you know, highest priorities. And so many different groups and entities that are associated with the trust were really being responsive to their stakeholders. You know, I think about the Immigration Funders Collaborative, all of the affinity funds, the Arts Work Fund, also the Illinois COVID Rapid Response Fund was housed at the trust, which was a statewide effort that was rapid response. I wanted to spend most of my time just talking about the COVID Rapid Response Fund that we set up for Chicago. And, you know, I wanted to step back, and I appreciate us having this conversation and looking back at 2020, just because how we all pivoted, I think is an important story to tell. But it's really important to remember that we are all still responding to COVID and the racial uprisings. And while there are some key learnings, I think part of this conversation is to really, you know, pull through the learning that we had this past year and really think about how that'll change the work that we do moving forward. And, you know, I was looking at some of the dashboards, and early March, right, as the city and the state started collecting information on COVID, the positivity rate, the first number I saw was 2.6, and yesterday we're still at 5.6. And while that number is better than we've seen, you know, I recognize that, you know, we're very much still facing and responding to you know, the things that we saw in 2020. And you know, I also want to mention that, you know, unfortunately, Chicago experienced 4,635 lives lost, and 72% of the lives lost, the deaths were of Black and Latinx residents. So recognizing that, you know, Black and Latinx populations are disproportionately impacted by COVID, I think is important. With that said, you know, as Mignon mentioned, you know, back in March, when we had the privilege of kind of shifting our work to being remote, and our families were thinking about working environments and school going fully remote, we were in early conversations with United Way and partnered with them to create the COVID Rapid Response Fund that many of the folks on this call were either contributors and or benefited. And, you know, in a matter of a week, so we officially started on the 16th, but, you know, in a matter of a week from the first conversation on the 13th to the 20th, we stood up a fund, we set up the governance, and started with early fundraising, and had our first round of funding approved by the 20th. So, the whole point was to be rapid response and address the immediate needs. And we used the data that we had available, which was not a lot at the time, but we recognized how important it was to be responsive and to be iterative and to be flexible. I think early on, we saw that many of our stakeholders, including organizations, were responding to the call, regardless of funding. They pivoted their programs, right? And despite hearing dips and decreases in staffing and volunteers and canceled revenue generating events and fundraisers and increases to the call for services, and also, facing challenges and budgetary constraints about how to maintain the protocols to respond to COVID and to be, for cleaning and deep cleaning. We just knew that as the organizations were being responsive, that we had a responsibility to support that work.
So Anna, there's a question that came through about will there be another round of this COVID-19 funding, and what will be the focus of that?
So the two funds, both the Illinois Fund has sunsetted, and the COVID Rapid Response Fund does have a remaining balance. So we will be having a last round of funding. However, the whole idea was for that to be responsive and address the immediate needs of COVID. So we are also sunsetting that fund, and the trust is thinking about recovery with many partners here as we think about an equitable recovery with Together We Rise.
All righty, we're going to thank you so much, Mignon and Anna. Tony, Owen, and Steve. Tony, I'll start with you. You mentioned when you were doing your introduction, you mentioned some work, some expansion in territory that happened at your foundation. Just wanted to give you an opportunity to expound on that a little bit more in relation to how the foundation responded to COVID.
Sure. So, we shared similar experiences to the trust and my colleagues here on this call, as well as other funders. When, as I mentioned before in our conversation, 97% of our funds are restricted. So we did not have, at that time in March, available funds to distribute right away. So the board and I made the decision to dip into our endowment a little bit to provide immediate funding. And the first couple of outreach/requests that we received were from organizations that supported the surrounding communities. And Housing Forward was one of those organizations. And we needed to move quickly. So we took money out of one portion of our endowment to provide immediate response, and Housing Forward supported, Forest Park, Western Cook County. The others were Beyond Hunger, and as well as West Cook YMCA, which ironically, many of their participants who use the programs are located in the southern Western Cook County area. After that, we realized, and we created this fund, and since we didn't have money, we had to do a fundraising effort. But what we realized is that many other organizations in Western Cook County, they were supported by organizations such as the Trust or Grand Victoria, but there were some that did not have the ear of the foundations. And we quickly took a look at those smaller organizations that might not have the massive numbers as a Housing Forward or Beyond Hunger. And we were very intentional with trying to provide assistance to them. So when we did our fundraising efforts, we provided those grants. Out of 63 nonprofit organizations that we supported, 40% were new organizations that we have never supported before. About 35% of those were organizations, or actually that 40%. The majority of those were organizations that were either located in Forest Park, Cicero, Berwyn, Maywood. So we quickly realized that, you know, we're kind of like the little hub of Western Cook County, so to speak. And we focused on those areas. The organizations that were in Oak Park River Forest, we didn't leave them behind. We also focused a good chunk of funding there. But the need was so tremendous in so many different areas. And, you know, we did as much as we could. We were one of the recipients of the Illinois COVID-19 Fund, and I want to thank Anna Lee and Sharon Bush and the Alliance of Community Foundations who worked on that. Their leadership was tremendous. And we, because of our outreach, we actually became more noticed by some of our donors and within our donor family. And they actually gave more because they realized that the dollars that they were distributing to our Rapid Response and Recovery Fund, we actually threw the recovery word in there because we knew this was going to be a very long-term type of work that we had to do. We had a donor who actually did a $250,000 match, which helped us get to over $1 million in support. So we knew that, you know, we were on the ground and talking to nonprofit leaders, and, you know, had a focus that there had to be some help for those smaller nonprofits who do so much for their community with so little. And we did our best to support them in any way that we can.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. It was so amazing to see individuals stand up and support the response and recovery to COVID. So certainly, you know, I want to, Owen and Steve, I'm going to come back to you all. So don't want you all to feel slighted or, you know, forgotten. Don't do that. But we got some amazing questions in the Q&A chat. And, you know, we promised that this panel is all about our colleagues, our audience. So want to make sure we pull them in. And so, Stuart, I think we have a question, a couple of questions for our panelists about COVID. So you want to jump in?
So there was a specific question to Anna about the ones that were not funded by the first round. Are they eligible for the second round? The other, so we'll get to that in a second, but the other ones I think are related, that I'm seeing are related to the second one we had planned. So we'll hold and incorporate those into that. But Anna, the response there about second round and who's eligible.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So there, I want to just clarify, the fund is setting, you know, it's sunsetting. We've had multiple rounds. We've had 6 rounds of funding, and there was one open application process. So we will not be opening it up. We received over 700 applications from organizations that have been responsive, and you know, we just continue to go to that pool. For the last round, we're really thinking about, the last 2 rounds have been thinking about more capstone projects, more long-term projects that are very much responsive to COVID and thinking about equitable recovery.
Okay, great.
All right, thank you, Anna, for that. Steve, anything in particular? I know Tony mentioned the partnership with Grand Victoria and their foundation's response to COVID. Want to bring you in to talk about more specific work that Grand Victoria did in response to COVID.
Yeah, sure. Just to start, you know, we contributed to the Chicago COVID Response Fund, but I would say, you know, we were more heavily involved, mostly through the leadership of Sharon in the Illinois COVID Response Fund. And I think in that space, you know, one thing that we tell ourselves as staff we want to be mindful of is just continuing to also advocate for kind of the structural reasons why we're going through these disparities and we're seeing the disproportionate impact on Black and Latinx communities in this moment. And so that is how we really focused our time and energy around COVID. You know, I had the opportunity to establish a really local Elgin COVID response fund. It was much more modest in relation to some of the other funds that were out there. But similarly, you know, we were considering how do we get, you know, direct financial assistance in the hands of those who are really being impacted by this right now in the Elgin community. And that was a partnership with United Way and several family foundations and the city of Elgin. And so I think that was like we saw across the state, another testament to how, you know, different partnerships were able to be formed in this moment because of the urgency. And, you know, like others, we changed some of our internal processes, really made sure that our current grantee partners were able to get some extra resources as a result of COVID. Streamlining that process, I think, is a lesson that a lot of foundations learn through this process, and how do we streamline applications and reporting so that burden that our partners face in trying to access the resources they need in this important moment could be easier. So yeah, I'd say largely it was contributing COVID funds, local and statewide, and then also just making sure that our grantee partners had what they needed, and continuing to be in community to learn how the needs and how the issues that are intersecting with the pandemic, just have our ear to the ground and really see how needs are changing and transforming.
You know, thank you, Steve. You know, I can say, you know, as a frontline fundraiser, and Owen, I'm coming in your direction. As a frontline fundraiser, I'm very grateful for the leniency and the flexibility that foundations that foundations implemented in response to COVID with us as grantees. That, you know, we couldn't, you know, some of us, a lot of our organizations did see a reduction in workforce because of the impact of COVID, which means that we had the same amount of work, but less people to do it. And so, you know, foundations did say, you know, we can wait on that report, or instead of doing a written report, we can do an oral report, or instead of you filling out a lengthy application, just give us a couple of paragraphs. So, you know, all of those strategies to help grantees stay focused on serving were amazing. And so I'm glad to hear that some of those strategies will stay in place. And Jan spoke to that earlier. Owen, anything specific you want to share about JP Morgan and the response to COVID before we move on to our next question?
Yeah, and it's so helpful to hear the insights and reflections. We probably don't do this enough, so I'm like taking lots of notes from my fellow panelists here. I'd say, I mean, we did many of the similar things you've heard, and I'm sure many of you have experienced in terms of converting programmatic grants to general operating, doing lots of no-cost extensions, restructuring grants because the conditions, you know, particularly the economic conditions facing families and, you know, the workers, homeowners, small businesses have all changed dramatically. So we've tried to be as flexible as possible. And a question came up in the chat, and someone else mentioned, like, are these going to stay? You know, for us, we're not going to be massively shifting to lots of, you know, general operating grants across the board. But I do think we've learned some really interesting lessons from what the benefits of being more flexible in our grant making processes. I don't know exactly what that will look like, but I think that, you know, if we're looking for silver linings in COVID, I think across different sectors and areas, like, it's all taught us how to do things differently and in some ways that that could be productive in other areas. So so I think some of that will stick with us. Anna mentioned the importance of thinking about recovery, about immediate response and longer term recovery. And the recovery piece is more of our focus and our sweet spot. So we did do some immediate response grant making around basic needs, but really have been thinking about what's needed for this region to have a more inclusive recovery than, for example, the one that we saw after the financial crisis, recognizing that we are in the midst of seeing inequities and racial inequities in particular, gender inequities just being blown wide open right now. And so two ways we've been thinking about that. One is where it's embedded in our strategies. So for one example, in our workforce development area, we do a lot around healthcare career pathways and have really focused a lot. We've done some work in public health before, but recognizing that just, the lack of public health capacity in neighborhoods, like that's a public health issue. It's also a workforce issue. And so we've been thinking a lot about, for example, if there's public funding coming, and some has already come around contact tracers, resource navigators, vaccine, et cetera, how do we make sure that those opportunities that are created are not just one-offs for the people who are in them, but are a way that they can be attached to a longer-term career pathway that gets them into a family-sustaining career. The other thing I'll just flag, and many folks are a part of this, is just the importance of collaboration. Like the crisis that we are facing is, beyond the scale of any foundation, it's beyond the scale of any community, it's beyond the scale of any corporation. And so we have been looking across, and whether it's, the COVID response fund and, philanthropic coordination around that area, corporate collaboration, companies that are disrupted and their employees are being impacted. And I know, we're going to talk about the impact of George Floyd's killing as well, racial equity coming to the floor in a different way, companies making commitments, but really having to think deeply about what it means to deliver on those statements and commitments. So corporate collaboration, I think, has been really important. And there's a new group called the Corporate Coalition in Chicago that's working on those issues in particular. And then the last is, and the most important, is community collaboration. So how are we empowering people in community who are experiencing the disruption of the past year to have a stronger voice in what the response looks like? And so that cuts across, the philanthropic space, where I think, love the point about, Steve's point about like maintaining our ear to the ground. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you guys, just to be candid, like that has been the hardest part of my work this year, is not being in community with people. And you have to be that much more intentional about making sure that you have those listening posts and that you're engaged with folks, because it's just different to do a grantee meeting when you're doing it over Zoom than when you're walking through a space and you're talking to participants in a program, or you're meeting with board members and community stakeholders. But that community collaboration, that community capacity is critical, and has been a lot of what we're thinking about, both for immediate response as well as recovery.
Thank you, Owen. There were a couple of things that came up, and we are going to get to them. Tony mentioned tapping into the endowment to provide support to communities, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But I want to, this is not even a shift. We started this conversation talking about the COVID pandemic, and we know we all survived 2020, and we know that that's not the only disease that we had to face. We faced the disease of structural discrimination, institutionalized racism. We saw not only the murder, or that I call it the execution of Mr. George Floyd, but we saw the invasion and the murder of Breonna Taylor, and the shooting of Jacob Blake, and the invasion of privacy, and the invasion on Black bodies, and just the taking of Black lives without accountability. We saw that throughout 2020, and it wasn't new. It's not anything new in America. It's just that a couple of things happened in 2020 because of the pandemic, and we had to shelter in place. We didn't have any distractions, or they were minimal, or they were different. And so we were at home, and we saw that 8 minutes and 46 seconds. We saw the videos of the police going into Miss Taylor's home, or Miss Anjanette Taylor's home. We saw all of that, and we saw it repeatedly. And so we also saw the anger and the frustration that's been built up, not just in 2020 or 2019, but over years of facing discrimination and racism. We saw all of that boil up in 2020. And so we saw the mass protests throughout our city, Chicago, throughout the nation. And then we saw it worldwide, Australia, and some of our other friends internationally who, saw what was happening in America and spoke out about it. So we saw all of this. And I just want to ask for, just transparency. We are all professionals and we have a job to do, but we're human beings. And we saw what happened to other human beings in 2020 as a result of racism and the lack of accountability for law enforcement and even some of our political officials. And so just want to ask, just kind of step back a little bit and just ask for what you all experienced as professionals in 2020 in relation to, I would say probably that Mr. Floyd's execution really catapulted a lot of conversations about white privilege, about class privilege, about racism and structural and institutional racism and discrimination. So it catapulted a lot for a lot of people. For some folks, it was, is this just a symptom? But for many of us, we knew that it's an insidious disease that we've all been dealing with and living with. And so I just want to ask for your feedback, your perspectives on how your foundations shifted, responded internally and externally to the protests, to the killings, to the shootings. What did your foundations do behind closed doors and to the public? And so Owen and Stephen are going to lead the response to this. And Owen, I'll go ahead and start with you.
Sure. And Jennifer, I really appreciate this being a central question because I think it gets at everything that we do in philanthropy and where along the continuum from root causes of issues that have existed as long as any of us have been here and prior, and we know exist for a long time, to that, meeting immediate needs. And I think it's important to know where we need solutions across that spectrum. And it's really important for organizations and for foundations to be very clear about which piece of that of the puzzle that they're working on. So to your specific question, I mentioned our work around racial equity when it comes to the economy. That work continues, and certainly I think it has really accelerated a lot of our foundation's focus on what we need to do differently, both in terms of what we're funding, but also how we're funding. And so we are looking at things that I would not have imagined in different markets, in pilots and things like that. So none of this is a commitment, but I'll just share, I mentioned some of the unrestricted grant funding. Like we think that's a very important tool to empower organizations led by people of color serving communities of color. Taking a closer look at what our overall grant portfolios look like and who has a voice in grant making. And so participatory grant making is something that, an area that I think we have a huge amount to learn from. More tangibly and specifically, there were a number of racial justice initiatives and approaches that emerged in the immediate wake of George Floyd's murder. And so we looked outside of our traditional focus on the economy to think about racial justice and think about power building in communities of color and for leaders of color. And so some of that, I work in the Twin Cities, and obviously there it's just extremely acute, but in Chicago as well, working with organizations like the Shriver Center that are focused in those areas. Another critical component of this from our perspective was the civil unrest that followed and the impact that had in communities. And so particularly where there was any destruction that happened in neighborhoods, how do we, we've seen so many patterns of community destruction and rebuilding where power shifts from community to other actors. And so a big focus of our work in that area has been, how do we ensure that communities have a stake in, a voice in, and ownership of the future trajectory of their neighborhoods. Again, that's something that we work on in other areas, but the need clearly so acute. And then more broadly, our foundation is a part of, and we work very closely with the business of JP Morgan Chase. And we recognize that the financial services industry and our firm has had a role to play around disinvestment in communities of color, and a lot in not sufficiently investing in, and often being a barrier to wealth building. And so we work from a corporate responsibility perspective. Where I sit, we work very closely with the lines of business that are thinking about these issues. Sometimes our partners, our grantees, and folks within our foundation can provide really valuable insight in terms of what are the barriers to creating more equitable investment and more equitable development in the neighborhoods and for the communities where we work. And so that has, we've made some philanthropic commitments specifically focused around racial justice, but I would point much more broadly to the overall commitment that the firm made, because it's one thing that I think about every day is, on the one hand, we have a lot of philanthropic resources, but if the firm itself, if the bank itself gets its practices and policies and products right, and uses those as a way to drive more equitable economic opportunity, that's a much bigger lever than what we can do alone from a philanthropy perspective.
Okay, thank you, Oren. We do have a question that popped in the chat for you, but before Steve leaves, Steve has to leave us at 10. So I want to pivot to Steve because we also have a couple of questions from the audience for him. So Steve, would love to get your perspective on Grand Victoria's response to the racism pandemic that we saw in 2020, the heighten of it. So I want to pull you in and then pose a couple of questions from the audience to you before you have to hop off.
Great, thank you. And just echoing what Owen said, I really appreciate this question. Thank you, Jennifer, for that intro to the question as well. I just want to start by saying, like, unequivocally for us, the murder of George Floyd was another example of historical violence against the Black community. It's a manifestation of structural racism, and it's deeply rooted, as you mentioned, Jennifer, in this nation's history. Also want to start by saying that we really want to honor, acknowledge the work of Black organizers, activists, and leaders who've done the groundwork over decades to allow us to have the type of conversation that we're having now, to have a moment where, President Biden will name white supremacy, that work was done by folks on the ground nationwide. And here, in Chicago, definitely, there have been incredible young leaders that have been leading these movements. So we want to acknowledge them. I can say that for us, it reinforced an internal process and over the past couple of years to focus on racial equity and racial justice. Internally, I mentioned we are a BIPOC-led majority, BIPOC staff and board even that believes in the personal being political. And we name anti-Blackness and white supremacy in our meetings. We talk about structural systemic racism. And, it's been absolutely crucial for us to make space for ourselves to express anger and sadness and confront trauma. And I really believe that as Grand Victoria Foundation's culture, we truly benefited that there was an emphasis on racial equity that was already in progress, and it was evident in our culture. And I think the team that was built by Sharon, and it's definitely a blessing to be able to make that connection, because yes, we have we have folks on our staff that are directly impacted by these inequities that we're facing, be it the topic at hand, be it the disproportionate impact of COVID, on the Black and Brown communities. So internally, we've made a lot of space, and we've continued to confront, what's happening with the uprisings and the structural racism that we're seeing, and think about how our grant making strategy needs to adjust as a result. In our grant making, we've focused on racial justice and not just racial equity, and racial justice being the who and the how we achieve racial equity. And a lot of that is emphasized, uplifting the voices of Black and Brown leaders and organizations, and overall, in a more general sense, the directly impacted. We talk about these issues all the time, and we all know that philanthropy historically has not had an equitable investment in BIPOC communities. So whether it's, Sharon working with CAPE, the Chicago African Americans in Philanthropy, and working on an Illinois Black Advocacy Project that, is hoping to realize a statewide Black policy agenda by and for Black leaders, right? Whether it's my colleague Fanny working with Communities United, who has these voice youth leaders that have been working on statewide school discipline reform, or my colleague Nita in the economy working with the Raise the Floor Alliance to really focus on workers' rights. Or even in Elgin, we just launched Elevate in Equity, which is a grassroots grant making project initiative that is led by Elgin residents in an effort to really have, our grassroots directly impacted leaders guide decision making and have that power. Overall, like, this has been the process and journey that we've been on, and with every kind of example of the structural racism that we see, we continue to try to refine our grant making. We are really emphasizing again, like, how are the directly impacted community members involved, and informing how we're doing our grant making as well. So while we do not, have a program specifically around police violence, we're looking at this work as intersectional, and making sure that we are staying committed to the movement building work that's happening. We're trying to refine how we are accountable to our communities, and really, tackling these issues from a systemic standpoint.
Steve, thank you so much for that.
Steve, can I ask two really quick questions before you have to go, if you have time for them, that have come in from the audience? One is can you explain just briefly the 5th E of engagement, what you mean by that? And the other, I can't find, I lost somehow, I wanted to read the exact question, but I think the question was, the person thought that philanthropic response in the suburbs had been historically slower. And I just want to things like poverty and the changing population and whatnot. And I just wanted to, since you work in the suburbs, if you have any response to how you see that changing.
Absolutely. Before I forget, I just want to say thank you to my fellow panelists and to Jennifer Stewart and Philanthropy Club just for organizing this. To the first question, which one was the first question? It was about
engagement, the E.
Yeah, the 5th E. I tried to respond to that question. I'm doing my best to respond to the ones that are directed at me. If you go to our website, you can read a short, brief description about the engagement area. We recently hired Angela Rudolph, who is our new Director of Equity, again, on this process of really bringing racial equity, racial justice integrated into our work. I encourage you all to kind of read that section of the website and maybe reach out to Angela. Angela is going to be spearheading the engagement program area into the future. And Angela is amazing, and I'm sure that program is going to continue to do amazing work. So that's my answer to that. As far as resources and the philanthropic response in the suburbs, yeah, as someone who's having a lot of conversations in Elgin and the region, you know, I definitely heard a big concern about there being equitable resources going out into the suburbs. And we definitely heard it with the COVID response fund. So yes, you know, we are seeing, and this isn't a new trend actually, where the demographics have been changing in the suburbs. And we really have communities that are in need and are living in poverty and facing, you know, all of these manifestations of racism. A lot of these violent acts are happening in suburban areas. And so, yes, you know, to put it, you know, my short response is, yeah, we really do need to think about the investment that's happening in the suburbs and cultivating more resources, because these issues are acute, they're urgent. And yeah, and, you know, I'm open to talking to whoever about how to organize and think about how we build more of a philanthropic response, as they put it, in the suburbs and central, downstate, you know, across Illinois.
Sounds like an interesting topic for another philanthropy club. Thanks, Steve. I think that was great.
Thank you all.
Hey, Steve, thanks for joining us. Have a great day.
All righty, take care, everyone.
Bye. I don't want to pick anybody, but I'm going to have to. So on the question of how your foundation has responded to what we saw in 2020, the heightened just hatred through racism, white supremacy, fake news, the changing of narratives from victims to perpetrators, just all of the stuff that we saw is so much. We literally could do a panel just about this particular question, but just want to bring that back and ask Tony, anything in specific, and then I'll come to you next, Anna. Tony, anything specific that your staff and your foundation did in response to what we saw in 2020 around institutionalized racism and the protests and so forth?
Sure. Thank you for the question. Our work has been primarily focused internally. You know, we are a foundation that was very traditional in terms of its grant making. We were looking at programmatic work. We were looking at, you know, quite frankly, things that, you know, we felt that we provided a grant and made us feel good, and, you know, we were okay and we moved forward. What happened in 2020, and what's really happened for decades and decades, we can no longer ignore it. And, you know, and if anyone knows about Oak Park and River Forest demographics, wealthy, white, it was something that the foundation had to really take a look at internally and see what we're doing in response to this. Like, what does this mean for the wellness of our community? Are we being inclusive? Are we really working on equity? What things have we helped along that we say that we're going to help fix, that we perpetuated along the way because of our practices and everything that we do? And this past year, it was I don't want to say a pivot. It was a punch to the gut that we had to do something. I've been at the organization for 2.5 years. And, you know, as a new leader, new in this role as the Trust House Director of Development. So it was my own personal journey and experiences that I brought to the table, and discussions and examples that we provided and so on. At the end of the day, we are now in the process of redefining our vision, our mission, our core principles. I can't say what they are just yet, but know that we are looking at things such as racial justice, equity, inclusivity, values such as courage. And the dynamic has been quite interesting because we took a look at look at ourselves through trainings. We did a series of 5 anti-racism trainings, and we had some hard discussions. And these trainings were board and staff over the course from October to the most recent one a couple weeks ago. And it left us with, for many of us, even a moment of self-reflection. And a lot of these things we talk about, how does that translate to work? And that is one of the things is, and Steve mentioned this earlier, there's already so many people so many organizations who are doing this that need our help for this work. And for an organization that doesn't have capacity in terms of staff or the immense amount of resources that others do, we can actually still be very thoughtful and work in collaboration and be of help to these groups that reach out to different communities within Oak Park River Forest and our surrounding area. Another thing that we noticed is that our reach was not that far. We did help, BIPOC communities, but did we involve them? Did we ask what are their needs? So it's a complete transformation, and I think it's going to be very, I don't want to say exciting, but it's going to be much more intentional, much more direct work that we're going to do in 2021 because of what happened in 2020. And we're just now starting to use words like white supremacy, which have never been used before in our area. And there's many of you who live in our area, so or worked in our area, and that's something that that the tensions that continue. And ironically, I started the organization when we had the America to Me documentary at the high school level that highlighted some of this stuff. And there were many people who did not believe that. And we keep receiving examples and examples and examples. Real life, tragedies, trauma that is happening. And what all this finally said to us as an organization and as leaders of the organization is like, okay, we have to stop. We have to think about what we're bringing to the table and what are we doing ourselves to perpetuate this, and understand the power that we can actually change this. So that's where we're at as an organization at this time.
Tony, what I appreciate, there was so much wealth in what you just shared. And you and Steve both and Owen spoke very well to the fact that the personal reflection piece, the individual piece. So it's not as if we show up to work and we leave our humanity at home. That's not how it works. We bring our full selves to our work. And so in order for us to see shifts in our organization, there has to be shifts within us internally. Mm-hmm. There has to be some self-reckoning and, some self-reflection internally, because it's individuals that make up teams, and teams that make up staffs, and staffs that make organizations, and organizations that make communities, and people who make nations. And so we can't have a national or a local or an organizational transformation without individuals doing their own work also. So I want to thank you, and Steve, I'll thank him later, but I want to thank you for highlighting that. And so Anna, want to turn it over to you, and then afterwards turn it over to Mignon. So Anna.
Thank you. There's been so much wisdom already shared here, and Jennifer, thank you so much for framing that question and your, bringing your authentic yourself, and the framing of racial equity. I want to first just talk about the COVID Rapid Response Fund, which was always, as I mentioned, we were going to be responsive to the changing landscape. After George Floyd's murder, our gut was that we had to respond, right? And thankfully, it didn't take any convincing for the fund to support efforts to respond. Immediately, I think the steering committee and all of the different stakeholders just supported it 100%. We knew that COVID-19 had uncovered a lot of the longstanding inequities. And I think the murder of George Floyd's just was a call to action for us. And so we responded with the fund, continued to respond to the immediate needs and thinking about food insecurity, cleanup in communities that were disproportionately impacted by a lot of the justified uprisings. And I think long-term, we just recognize the same communities that are being disproportionately impacted by COVID, facing the food insecurity, but also thinking about over-policing, right? And I often quote my colleague, Deborah Bennett over from Polk, who talks about the safest communities, those that are most thriving and connected are not those that are over-policed, right? So the Trust has been thinking about, in addition to our continued work with the Partnership for Safe and Peaceful Communities, which includes the Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability, GAPA, thinking about our work with community safety and also community-led and community-informed justice as well. And I am working, that's a shared strategy with my colleague, Daniel Ash, in building collective power. And then, another question that was asked about just practices at our organization. And we are so lucky to be led by Helene Gale, a BIPOC leader, a nationally known public health expert. And I think in this moment, her voice as a Black woman who has had extensive experience in philanthropy, but also, a lot of experience navigating public health crises has been just incredible. And she has been, even early on, as we were, we raised $35 million for the COVID Rapid Response Fund. And she knew that this was an opportunity to engage a lot of soft hearts and open hearts to think about what an equitable recovery for our region meant. She also, I don't know how, but in the midst of all of this work, was also engaged nationally, early on thinking about an equitable distribution of the vaccine as well. And a lot of that framework that she helped design are being implemented or being adopted by several different municipalities and markets. I also want to just bring it back and talk a bit about our practices, Jennifer, because you were just talking about like, how do we, do this on the individual and more organizational effort. And, the Trust has had an equity team to think about our policies and our principles. But that has been reinvigorated and more robust. So we have just announced a cross-departmental team thinking about equity principles and looking at all of our hiring policies and our practices. With regards to our grant making and our change making activities, the Trust for a long time has been providing general operating grants and will continue to do that. We think that that is just really important for the organizations that we've been working with for a long time to be responsive and be able to pivot amidst this changing landscape. And I think I'll talk a little bit more later just about Together We Rise, which is our framework to think about an equitable economic recovery. Oh, and one thing I want to mention too is, just like Owen had said, we were so hungry to hear from our partners, but we also recognized that that was more about our feeling good and making sure that we reached out. And many of our organizations were on the front lines addressing all of these immediate needs. And we were so grateful to Forefront, who were, and their survey. And we thought, if Forefront is doing that, if other foundations are already doing that, we will share information. Like, no need for us to do that, because we don't want our development colleagues to say, oh, the Trust, one of our funders is wanting a survey and complete. We just didn't want to do that. So we wanted to coordinate and make it less burdensome. So
Thank you, Anna Mignon. I believe that the Prince Charitable Trust has seen some internal shifts in response to the manifestation, or the heightened manifestation, or visibility is more appropriate, the heightened visibility of the lack of police accountability and systemic and institutionalized racism. So just wanted to bring you in to share on this particular question.
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer. It's been so informative and wonderful to listen to my colleagues talk about the journeys that their organizations are going through. I'll share a little bit about ours, that I can. So we probably a few years ago started doing some, I'm going to call it quiet shifting of our giving, without any, kind of pronouncements really on our website, but us looking internally around how we were doing our giving and where we were doing our giving. And so as part of that process, we started to open up funding and give to more community-based organizations, to look at organizations that were led by leaders of color and who were employing and investing in people with lived experiences. And so we kind of was, doing that kind of in a quiet way, and having conversations about racial equity. And then, like everyone else, the events of the summer was a shock to our system, and created a realization that whatever we decide to do as a foundation, it has to be out loud, for lack of a better way to say it. That we have to name what we're doing, and we need to be vocal in our advocacy around racial equity. It can't just be this kind of quiet thing we're doing in the background. So as I mentioned, we did most of our grant making was done by July. So what that meant was that it didn't allow us to do a lot of additional funding around racial equity or police accountability. But what it did do is it freed up some time in the latter part of the year for us to begin internal work. And so I guess similar to what Tony said, where our focus was for the latter half of 2020 was doing the internal work, doing trainings, investing in an equity audit of our organization to look strategically at how we function as an organization in terms of hiring, programming, investments across the board. We're in that process. We finished the first phase of that in early January. We got our report out from the group we were working with, the consultants. We're moving into the next phase of that work. We have made kind of a conscious decision to not put up a lot of kind of statements, because we didn't want to put up statements until we had action to back that up. So we wanted to do the internal work, and so that then when we put out a statement about what our values and our vision it is accompanied by the actions that we're going to take. So so that's where we are in our process. It's a little I would say the complicated things for us is that we're not just looking at the Chicago program, we're looking across the foundation. And so that is a different kind of work that we don't do as a foundation in a lot of other areas. And so it's forcing us to look at across Chicago, DC, and Newport in a new way. And how do we as a complete foundation create vision and core values around racial equity. And then what does that look like in each city? Because each city has different demographics, different needs, you know, so it's a little bit of a tricky situation for us in that way. I'll just say one more thing, and that is just looking at just regular processes, you know, like the trust, the community trust, we do almost exclusively general operating support. That's kind of always been our way of operating. Continuing to look at ways to streamline our processes, moving the final reports to conversations. We've been doing a lot of looking into trust-based philanthropy, participatory grant making, other things that can make our work more accessible. We've had here in Chicago, we funded an initiative called Black Talk, where it was a series of conversations with members of the Black community around the environment and how not how to get people involved in the environment, but how do we recognize the work that's already being done around the environment that maybe doesn't fit into the way we describe the environment, right? How do we figure out what's happening on the ground that we're missing, that we could be funding, because it doesn't fit into kind of the box that we've created. So that work is ongoing. So it's a process, but one that I'm feeling positive about the fruits that it will bear.
Thank you, Mignon. I think we're going to take the next 8 minutes or so and just focus on questions from our audience. So, Stuart, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then we'll take the last minute or so just to talk about upcoming programs.
I just wanted to say that, Mignon, thank you for that. And the concept of trust-based philanthropy is very intriguing, and I think ought to be a topic of a future Philanthropy Club meeting. I think that's very important. But there was a good question that I thought kind of ties this all together that came in through the chat. And I think it's a good one to spend a little time on. How are your organizations balancing and prioritizing the needs for direct service delivery with the need to address systemic change? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Because I mean, I can, you've talked about doing both, but it's come, there must be some funding decisions that are in there, and how is this affecting those?
I'm happy to answer it. I just think about early on as we focused on addressing critical needs, I did feel like I was having many heart-to-heart conversations just because the placement of my strategy was unclear. People thought, oh, what does that mean to be an evergreen strategy? Is it somehow secondary to the closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap? And our thought was always, we have to do both, right? And that we do have to make some really tough decisions about the resources available, not just with grant dollars, but even, leveraging our networks and connecting to donors. And I know that COVID really showed and operationalized that our commitment to responding to immediate needs will always be there. We understand that you cannot talk about, and I think Owen and I, we've had this conversation, like we can't talk about economic recovery in these same communities that are facing, high rates and, just these unbelievable numbers and unacceptable numbers of losses of life due to gun violence, right? That they are in of the same. We have to do both. At the same time, we know that there are some tough decisions when it comes to, talking about supporting systems and policy work and the direct services piece. So that is a tension. I am there, and I am not the only one. I think top down, we recognize that we have to address the services piece, and that really does inform the policy work. We talked about that earlier, about how community organizing and that advocacy, which is more long-term, very much shapes policies. And so we see them as all tied. And, you know, I think that we also have an opportunity to engage donors as well. There's many donors who are involved at the trust, you know, they understand services. They understand, I want to help with scholarships, or, you know, food insecurity, or making sure that people have access to clothes. At the same time, that there is a continuum, right? That eventually we do have to start asking these hard questions about, but what are the root causes to that? Why again and again are the same communities that don't have access to good schools, you know, or are the ones that, you know, don't have access to credit and capital investment? So it is all in the same, and we tackle that, I think, on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. I let the others respond to this too, but I wanted to add in a question that I think is related that just came in, and that's the whole question about your endowments and whatnot and spending, like, it's like the move. There's some talk out there about spending more like 10% and 5% of the endowment. And so if you want to put that in the conversation as you respond to, I think that would be helpful too. If you're looking differently at your endowment as a result of all of this.
Yeah, so I'd be happy to follow Anna, and she said it perfectly in so many different ways, and we relate and with some of the ways that you're working on this. With us, it's interesting because with our donors are very interested in providing dollars for basic human needs, you know, food, clothing, shelter. We're very high in scholarships, particularly scholarships for communities to have not only for school, but also different experiences and so on. So they're very supportive of that. What I've been thinking, and as I mentioned before, we're going through a strategic point right now, is with our limited unrestricted resources, is there a way to work with our donors who have that strong continued interest in direct services, but work with them to also talk about the systemic issues and everything on the root causes of this? And right now we're working in our communication efforts with those donors in providing a huge overview of how all of this is intertwined and works together. And I'm also seriously considering that with our unrestricted resources, you know, if we have as we're building deeper relationships with our donors, perhaps our donors can, whether it's add a little bit more in basic human needs or fund some of the systemic work that we'll be doing, is to focus some of our resources that are unrestricted on the systemic issues. So it's a balancing act for community foundations. I'm sure the trust goes, you know, the same with the same, but what we're trying to do more is bring more people in the fold, because there's an acknowledgement, there's a thirst, there's a desire of donors to get more involved with the systemic part as well.
Yeah,
they
I think
understand
so.
the basic human needs. And I think that's our responsibility as a community foundation specifically, to be able to communicate, to show, to demonstrate, to provide data on how these different facets of philanthropy and the root causes of how philanthropy and capitalism have been intertwined and perpetuated a lot of these things. So it's a lot of deconstructing that we have to do, and a lot of changes in mindset. And that's a challenge, because it's generations of work and patience is needed. And as I remind in terms of, you know, you have the direct services right now at this moment, but as a community foundation that's supposed to be serving in perpetuity, we have to think long-term. And this is our time to start, you know, dismantling some of that thinking and rebuilding. Because at the end of the day, when there are conversations like, well, we're not in power or so on, I'm like, no, we're in power. We can be the change makers in this. So let's do this. Let's figure this out together.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tony. Yeah, we just got a few more minutes, but does somebody else want to respond to that question?
Yeah, I'll just throw out really quickly, Tony, what you were saying, and Anna, you were speaking to this too a little bit about people being, more focused on direct service. And it's interesting because we had some conversations with our trustees about moving to more, supporting systemic work, which we do some of. But what we found is that, we had a trustee who would kind of tune out sometimes in the board meetings when we talked about direct service work. And when we started to engage her around racial equity, we found that the reason she did is because she was frustrated. Because she's going, we fund the same stuff every year and it doesn't seem to be changing. And it was frustrating her. And she was actually excited to hear, oh, there's something else we can be doing. There's funding we can do that could maybe, address this. So we're not continuing to fund the same thing. So it was just interesting that, she wanted, it turned out she was like, yes, let's do more systemic work, because she was feeling the frustrations there. So you may run into some people who may be open to funding some other work when you're not even realizing that they are. I think the other thing, we don't have this as much as, but I hear a lot that people are a little leery of funding in advocacy spaces and organizing spaces, that there's some reluctance around that. And I think that's another area where there's education to be done about what is okay, what is legal for foundations to do around and fund around those issues. And I think that's another area that we have to address with our boards and with the community foundations, perhaps with your donors.
Thanks.
One thing, I'm sorry, Stuart, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, time is coming quick to the end, but go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. So we've been great co-moderators. We think the same already. So Stuart, who is a plant giving professional, I just want to thank you for helping Thought Partner and create this time. Anna, Antonio, Mignon, Owen, and Steve, who had to depart. Yeah. You all were amazing. Thank you so much for joining us. And it sounds like we need to do a part two.
Mignon wants to do one more quick thing.
One thing. There was an original question about response to the arts that we didn't get to. So if the person who was interested in that is on the call, I would be happy to talk about our response and support to the arts this year. Just reach out to me.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll make sure to make that connection, Mignon. Okay, thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Yep. Next month is in the chat. The information next month is in the chat.
Tony.
Everybody loves Annalise. Okay.
Everybody loves Tony. Bye, guys.
Take care, everybody.
All right, thanks, everybody.